sure, but they're really important. I would just two further points. One is that let's suppose the war comes to an end with a decisive victory for Ukraine, but no regime change in Russia. I think we have to think about a long-term in sanctions here, not just ending them. There are very few instances where sanctions bring regime change, but there are examples, and I think South Africa is the most dramatic one. The Forum, of course, actually played an important role in its early days in the transition there. And if you keep up sanctions for a long time and you make them stronger and stronger, they do work. So I think the way to think about it is military, short-run victory, sanctions is the long game. And then the final thing I'd say, and a bit from my own experience, in watching what happened in the early 90s, is if we do get a chance and there's a regime change, I think it's important that when the West come in, we look more at soft power and less at exploiting the minerals and the economy, more having, Muppets than McDonald's.
Muppets and McDonald's sounds like a plan for American conquest of the world, but that's okay.
Muppets, not McDonald's.
Okay. Oh, Muppets, not McDonald's, good. Obviously, we'll come back to the sanctions issue. There are roughly, if I'm right in saying, 39 countries applying them right now. So the ability of creating a South Africa type of regime may prove very difficult in the geopolitical environment I've been listening to here in Davos this last week. But let me just keep running around as we've got limited time. Karen, let me come to you next. It's a big question, but I've got to ask it to you. Worst and best scenarios, in your opinion, for how the war is going to play out, certainly over the next 6 months or so. But really worst and best.
Yeah.
What would you see from, obviously, I'd say from a Western perspective, how would you see it playing out?
Well, thank you for that. It's great to be here with this very distinguished panel. Look, it's likely the Russians are going to launch a spring offensive. They're going to likely have another round of mobilization soon. And so the meeting today, even in Ramstein, for the Defense Contact Group, which will discuss some of these big issues about heavier armaments, et cetera, for Ukraine, is very critical. So I think in that sense, given that we're anticipating this to happen, we're anticipating more Russian destruction of infrastructure, of killing more civilians, bombing, apartment buildings, all what we've seen. So I'd say on the best scenario is that the Ukrainians get the weapons they need very soon. They're able to deploy the Patriot. They're accelerating their training, as we know, the Patriot missiles to protect their cities. And the tanks will help push the Russians out of the positions inside Ukraine and the occupied parts of Ukraine. So best case is that they really push forward very quickly with the understanding that we don't want Russia to have the time to rearm and regroup, et cetera. So capitalizing on the momentum that they've seized. I think the worst case is, of course, just this dragging out and the aid coming in a bit too piecemeal, military aid coming in too piecemeal. There's other types of aid, economic aid, et cetera. And it just becomes this nasty war of attrition, even over the next year, where most of Ukraine is reduced to rubble. Now, there are certainly opportunities we can talk about for post-conflict. And can I just add one point to your point, Ken, about sanctions? If Putin is in power at the end of this, I think it's going to be an incredible challenge for Western countries, because who can shake that man's hand in the future, even if there's a peace agreement? There's blood all over his body for violating so many international laws and international norms. And this is also a new case. I don't think we've been in a situation like this. So not only sanctions will continue, but we will need to think, how do we deal with a pariah state going forward?
Yeah, obviously President Putin did not attend the G20 summit in Bali, so that kind of obviated certain types of risks. And I think a very important point. But yet again, within a G20 context, even I think we would find many countries not want to isolate President Putin. So it would put that divide would become even more apparent. Minister Beck, let me come to you. I think one of the big stories of this entire conflict, this horrendous conflict, has been the incredibly quick and dramatic way in which European governments have responded. And as somebody who must have been in a lot of these ministerial meetings where the sanctions packages have been put together, those have surprised many people, but so have the military packages that have been put together. So given where we are, rather than looking back and trying to look forward with trajectories, and having listened to the analysis you have here, is there a 9th, 10th, 11th kind of sanctions package coming? What's the appetite, you think, amongst the government specifically? We'll come to the Commission in a minute, an important role it's playing. What's the appetite here, both on the economic side, but also on the military side?
Right. Yes, over the last semester, I had the pleasure and privilege to be guardian of the famous European compromises, which was great fun for me. Exactly. So, well, I would say, you know, naturally it will depend on the development in Russia, the appetite for sanctions. But sanctions, for me, are not a goal in itself. Mm-hmm. And they will not win the war for Ukraine, and they will not win the conflict between the West and Russia. Mm-hmm. It's a way how to buy time for us in reality, because the sanctions are and will be circumvented. There will be countries not respecting them. So we buy time to rebuild our energy infrastructure. We need more pipelines from north to south and from south to north, not from the east to west in Europe. And we need to increase our defense capabilities. We need to increase the capacity of our defense industry in Europe. It is happening now. The number of licenses awarded by the Czech government to Czech companies is growing, and I should not speak about the exact numbers, but it's impressive. It happens in other countries in Europe, and we need time. So sanctions are a way how to buy time. Right. And for the first time, this agenda has been, the driving force behind that was the eastern part of the EU and the north of the EU. We see some shifts in dynamics in Europe recently. And if you look at the countries which yesterday prepared for Rammstein, it's quite clear. It's the Baltics, Poland, mm-hmm. Czech and Slovak Republic, the Danish colleagues, Dutch, and the UK. So you can see, well, some new coalitions in Europe, mm-hmm. including Swedes and Finnish. Yep. And that's quite interesting development for me. And it helped us to put forward this agenda of sanctions. And I truly believe we need to concentrate on our defense capabilities. That's important. That's the way how to win the war. To support directly Ukraine and to increase our ability to defend ourselves.
Very important points, and I think the way you've described it there, the sanctions are as much about Europe as they are about trying to change or influence the direction of the conflict itself, which in a way ties in. It's just a different way of measuring, but I think what I hear you saying here is there'll be a new Iron Curtain down potentially between Russia, at least as long as we're in this conflict environment, with a new energy infrastructure that isn't connected anymore. So it will be quite a different world. Maybe you don't like that term.
Well, no. It's a fact. You know, I was born in '64, and one of my first memories are Russian tanks in Prague in '68. Mm. So, well, for us and maybe from our friends from the Baltic countries, it's very clear that, well, we live in a world which is unfortunately a bit similar to our youth. Yeah. That's true.
Very interesting.
If I can just speak out of turn, I can't second strongly enough the building up defense capabilities in Europe. If this doesn't change the perspective in Europe, I don't know what will.
That's a fair point, and actually it's a good way to come through to Commissioner Dombrovskis. Commissioner, you've been obviously given your Executive Vice President role and the two portfolios you have right at the centre of the decision-making that's mattered here. Noticeable as well, the Commission playing a role with EU institutions on defence funds as well, the European Peace Facility. Whoever thought that would have happened? Can I ask you what, really you could comment on any of the things you've heard here and where you think Russia will be going, but if I can come in through one question, which do you think have been the most effective sanctions? Which are working the best? What is working the way you thought it would and potentially making a difference to the trajectory of this war?
Yeah, well, first of all, on sanctions against Russia, one thing is clear that we need to stay the course. So we need to continue put pressure on aggression Russia. We need to continue provide all necessary support to Ukraine. As the war is now dragging, of course, it's important that some kind of a fatigue in the West is not setting in, that we stay concentrated and provide necessary support. On sanctions against Russia, I would say sanctions are working, and there may be different ways looking at this, but if we look at Russia's economy was in recession last year and is going to be in even deeper recession this year, and last year that despite record high energy prices, which is a main Russia's export revenue, so that's a direct impact of the sanctions. Of course, Russia was helped by the fact that energy prices were record high, and ironically, one of the factors of those high energy prices was Russia's war against Ukraine. On a question which sanctions are most effective, first of all, I think all of those sanctions are needed. It's really a comprehensive set of sanctions. There are individual sanctions, financial sanctions, trade sanctions, economic sanctions. Because they have a cumulative effect. Right. And they have a different aims. So sanctions in the area of energy, it's primarily about reducing Russia's revenue base. Sanctions in the area of trade, reducing Russia's industrial and high-tech capacity, while putting pressure on individuals implicated in the war, may hopefully force some to reconsider or rather think about the consequences. But arguably, one can say that maybe the sanctions in energy sector are most important because that's Russia's main energy source. And we were a bit slow and late with oil embargo in the EU with the oil price cap at the G7. Okay, it's all done, and that's good. Now the discussions are ongoing also on oil products price cap. Hopefully this can be done next month. So it's important really to put pressure where Russia's main revenue source is. Obviously, Russia is finding other trade partners. Obviously, there is circumvention, so we need to monitor the implementation sanctions all the time. Close potential ways of circumventing, engaging with other countries. So it's an ongoing work also in terms of sanction implementation and enforcement. In terms of financial support, from the EU side, we are providing this year 18 billion euros macro-financial assistance plus. 3 billion euros were disbursed already this month. We are obviously in contact with other international donors, with US, with other G7 countries, with international financial institutions like IMF, World Bank.
Can I just ask you, that 18 billion is EU funds or includes member state funds within it, or that's separate to the bilateral?
That's separate to the bilaterals. That's a macro-financial assistance. That's a EU program of highly concessional loans, also with a grants component to cover the interest rate costs for Ukraine. And on top of this comes, obviously, whatever member states do bilaterally, humanitarian assistance, funding from the European Peace Fund, which you mentioned. So this MFA Plus is not all, but I would say that's a substantial part of this year's support. So important to stay the course and really help Ukraine to win this war.
Just one quick follow-up on this, because I think it'll go well to the next set of questions. America is quite famous for working on secondary sanctions. You talked about diversion, people circumventing the sanctions, and there's some probably quite close to, there's some circumvention, at least of trade, taking place very close to the European borders, Turkey is included. Do you think the EU might be getting into the secondary sanction business, if I can call it that, as well at the moment? Is that something that's on your roster for 2023?
Well, in any case, we are monitoring this closely because indeed there are new trade patterns emerging which suggest a circumvention of sanctions. We are engaging with those countries directly. I think we need to be open to different kind of options how to react and obviously do it in a close coordination with US.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Again, I think we come back to the other side of the coin from your first answer to my first question. How does Russia adapt? Can the Russian economy adapt? You're a historian of economics as well as an astute commentator of what's happening today. Do you think Russia has the wherewithal to adapt within itself and potentially through different trade routes? It is notable that only 39 countries imposing sanctions, many others very open to trading with Russia. Are there alternative routes that they could build up fast enough to stay the course?
Well, I want to come back to your point about secondary sanctions, and I think already we need to think about secondary sanctions where there's a gray market in things that can be used by the military. That really should be done immediately, and I'd include consumer products and business products that can be, as I mentioned, cannibalized. And I also think we need to sort of think about secondary sanctions in the context of if Russia escalates, what are we doing? We have to be ready to do that. That shouldn't take 4 months to be able to do that, and they should know that that's coming if they have to do something. Look, I mentioned at the outset that, and I agree with the minister, that sanctions are not alone. They're important. You have to stay the course. This war is going to be won through military, not through sanctions. That said, getting regime change is hard. Look at Iran, look at North Korea, look at Venezuela, look at Cuba. That's where Russia's headed. It's headed, don't forget about whatever the numbers are. It's headed to be Cuba, Venezuela, a giant Iran, maybe, the best description. Incredible poverty compared to what Russians had become accustomed to. And, will there be regime change? I hope so. But, that's it. We need to address the military side of this and want to have something happen in real time.
Okay, so a Russia that's adapted is not one that you see coming, one that really does end up getting constrained with the examples you've given here. Karen, let me come to you. Is the Western alliance, it's a similar question, enough to prevail in this conflict? Might we even be kind of losing some of the narrative? Again, I don't know about you, I've heard kind of two Davoses here, and there's different types of conversations about this future. Is Russia, with China's help, potentially being able to...
Yeah, and in fact, it's very interesting. I was here in May, along with a number of other people, and that's when I first realized about these different narratives and different approaches. You have the Russia-China alliance versus the West, and then there's the rest. And a lot of the rest are aligning with Russia and China. So we saw in March at the UN General Assembly with the resolution against the Russian aggression in Ukraine, 141 countries sided with the West on that. Or agreed that Russia had done this, but 35 countries abstained. And those countries come from the global south, but they don't just come from Africa, they come from Latin America. And of course, it's different in different parts of the world. In Africa, many of those countries were grateful for Russian support during liberation movements, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, South Africa. But they're also getting funds from the Chinese over time. They're buying into Russian misinformation. So you hear very different narratives. And I do worry about that a lot because I don't think the West wants to be isolated. I think there was a bit of a wake-up call. And for me, it certainly happened after the last Davos, where that became quite stark. The recommendation I've been making is it's the voices that should be out there speaking about this are, the minister and the commissioner, people from the former Soviet space who know exactly what Russian imperialism looks like. I mean, the argument that you hear is that the neo-imperialist West is, trying to bring Ukraine into Russian space. Even the Pope had some tweet in May, if you recall. He wasn't fully supportive, but he was also more on the fence than we thought. And so the credible voices are those people from that part of the world, and not the Americans or the Brits or the French who have, more spotted records, right? So that's the point I've been making.
Thank you very much. I'm just reminding everyone who's come in late, we're finishing the session at 9:30. I apologize that we don't have time for questions, a big program. So let me, therefore, just run round very quickly. Foreign Minister, I'm wondering, you're a minister, but you are in the government, obviously, and you've had the presidency and so on. What do you think the EU can do to build greater support internationally? So this is not just a sort of Europe America, a couple of allies. Is that something that worries you, or are you just totally focused on European support?
Well, I think we have to do much better on external relations of the EU. Some negotiations on free trade were dragging for years and years, and that's a huge mistake, I think. Yeah. And it's quite fortunate that, well, the Czech presidency is followed by Swedish. Czechs and Swedes are some sort of orphans after the UK left, you know, in the view of free trade. So we work hard on finalizing negotiations together with the Commission with Mercosur. That's quite important, you know, signal. These countries must get mutually convenient, conditions for trade with Europe, and that would bring them more on our side, I believe. The same concerns Africa. Commission is very active in this area, and we are supportive of that. So it resonates among the governments in the EU quite clearly now, and it's very clear. I was presiding one of the free trade meetings of ministers as replacement for other ministers. It was quite interesting for me to see that more and more countries see that if we lose the opportunities in the East, we have to be much more open to the South and to Latin America, for instance.
Very interesting points, and actually, again, a very good segue to you, Executive Vice President Dombrovskis. Maybe you could say something a little bit about how the EU is helping coordinate a response that makes sure that it is not just a small group, in essence, of countries fighting Russia of its aggression against Ukraine, its invasion of Ukraine. But also, what do you think, if you could say something about that, and what do you think is going to be left of Russia-EU relations? Is it just, it's basically war until this is over? What kind of future could you envision between Russia and the EU in the future? Those two.
Well, maybe I'll start with a second. On future of EU-Russia relations, well, I think it's clear that we need to decouple from Russia because we clearly cannot rely on, for example, Russian energy supplies. Russia has been openly using as a tool of blackmail and manipulation. So that's why we are now seeking alternative energy supplies. We did this for this winter. We'll need to do it now for the next winter. And in general, our strategy is to move away from Russian fossil fuel supplies. So it's clearly that we cannot rely on a country like this. On the longer-term perspectives, of course, first we need to help to bring the war to the end and bring the war to the end, which ends with Ukraine's victory. And then it's also the question on how Russia is engaged in this post-world war, because it's also Russia's duty as an aggressor to pay reparations to Ukraine. So there are many questions which will have to be answered in a context of those post-war relations. Is there any reflection ongoing in Russia itself about its imperialist aggressive policies, or are they just going to stay this course and feel just military defeated and plotting new aggressive plans? So those are the questions which Russia itself can answer, which those are not questions which we can answer instead of Russia. But of course, in between, it's also very important to win this battle of narratives, because we know that Russia has a very strong propaganda and disinformation machine, which is brainwashing Russian own population, which is active in West, as we know, and which is active also in a global South. So we need to step up those strategic communications also from our side to counter all kind of Russia's false narratives. For example, they were very actively blaming problems with food prices and food security on Western sanctions, whereas West has never sanctioned food or food deliveries. It was Russia's own manipulations and the fact that they were blocking Ukrainian food supplies, were where we were engaging very intensively actually to unblock those supplies due to through our own Solidarity Lanes initiative and through the UN-led initiative to unblock Black Sea ports. So on one hand, we obviously need to help a Global South to mitigate the consequences and impacts of the war, and something what we are doing. On the other hand, we need to be also more actively communicating our narrative and countering this Russian propaganda.
And trade agreements, you think, with the Global South as well? With Africa,
well, trade agreements, as the Minister already mentioned, indeed, it's very much on our agenda. We are working now indeed to diversify our economic relationships, also when we are moving away from dependency on Russian energy supplies, not to build up new dependencies, but really how to diversified supply chains for also now the green and digital economy. And that obviously includes building relations with Africa, with Latin America, engaging more intensively with ASEAN. Well, we have, if we talk about Latin America, recently concluded agreement with Chile. Right. Hopefully there is a momentum to unblock our stalemate on Mercosur, to finalize agreement with Mexico. We are considering restarting negotiations with Thailand, for example, in ASEAN region, finalizing economic partnership agreement with Kenya. Indeed, we're talking about global geography.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give you a 60-second answer to our last question. Ramstein Air Base, big discussion today on Leopard 2s. Where is the Czech Republic in this, and where do you see those central governments who also experienced Soviet imperialism in the old day? Will they have the opportunity to be able to sell, give and supply these tanks to Ukraine? I'm not sure if the Czech Republic has Leopard 2s or not.
We have emptied our storages of all Soviet weaponry already, so we need to do more.
Start emptying the German weaponry.
Well, yes, that's true. And I believe there will be a broad agreement on more supplies.
Yeah.
And it's quite clear for me that the only way further is, unfortunately, to arm Ukraine and ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a powerful last statement, but it's a powerful statement as well about the trajectory, if not specifically of Russia, which we heard some interesting comments about, the trajectory of Russia's relationship with its main neighbor, Europe, to its west. So with that, to finish on time, please, a wonderful panel. Give them a hand. Some of them can stay behind if you have questions and use up those 10-15 minutes to talk them questions bilaterally. But a strong hand, please, for this panel. Thank you very much.